Hello from Jerusalem and welcome to Bet Avichai. In just a few days, we will be marking Holocaust Memorial Day, and we chose to commemorate the day by inviting Dr. David Deutsch to share with us his work on belief, prayer, and religious devotion during the Holocaust. Dr. Deutsch is head of the Asia and Africa section at the International School for Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem and is a lecturer at Haifa University. As usual, we will be leaving a few minutes at the end for your questions, so feel free to use the chat. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I want to thank Bet Avichai. I want to thank USC Shoah Foundation for the resources and all the staff and people involved behind this webinar. And I'll just jump straight into it. The title of this lecture is Religious Observance in View of Deconstruction Processes in the Holocaust Practice, Prayer, and Belief. The issue at hand is what role did religious observance serve for the concentration camp prisoners? But before we dive into that topic, I would like to share with you a story that would sort of bring us closer to understanding the dilemmas of these prisoners. And that is when I talked to my grandfather, my late grandfather, and I asked him about his Jewish observance during the Holocaust and after. And he answered an answer that did not fit in to what I understood. He said there was nothing, not during and not after. He said that it took him time to go back to his Jewish observance. And not because of disbelief, because of irrelevance. And I'm saying that because the way I was informed, both in academia and in high school, is that religious belief, prayer, practice, those elements were positive elements for the concentration camp prisoners that provided for them hope. The word nothing was surprising to me in that context. And what I will try doing today, in the hour that we have together, is to try to unpack the idea of observance, of belief, of practice in that context. And not only to try to unpack, also to try to tackle the way historiography dealt with it. And let me be very clear on this. For many, many years, there is a leading paradigm of the role that this religious observance served for the concentration camp prisoners. A paradigm that we will unpack. And that paradigm basically stated the fact that religious observance, in all capacities, when it did appear, served as a positive element, as an element of continuity, as an element that enabled those prisoners to, I would not say to deal, but to regulate to some degree their realities. And what will happen in this lecture, I will show other aspects and other roles of Jewish observance. That being said, I would like to begin with the structure of this lecture. We will begin first of all with demonstrating the historiography regarding Jewish observance in the Holocaust. How did we understand it up until today? Or how did we understand it up until, I'd say, 10 or 15 years ago? What were the resources that informed our knowledge? Today we talk a lot about echo chambers. Also in academia there are echo chambers. Meaning, did we base it on oral testimonies, written testimonies? How many women were in those testimonies that informed the theory? And what are the theories? What are the main theories? What are their methodologies? So the first part of this lecture, which won't be that long, would be summing up the historiography up until today. What are the resources historiography uses? And what are their conclusions? After that, after the historiography part, then we will try to better understand what happens when we include other resources into this. In other words, when, to be very specific, what this lecture will have its focus on is oral testimonies. And those are the new resources we'll be using. And we'll be looking at what can we learn from these new resources? What could we learn from not only looking at written testimonies and how our theories could shift? And what were the blind spots of historiography? So that's more or less the structure of this webinar, beginning with historiography, their findings, and then moving on to oral testimonies. The majority of this lecture, this webinar, is about oral testimonies and unpacking the theories or patterns that we can see in those testimonies. So let's begin a bit about historiography and the continuity part, the outline I just showed you. Around, I would say, the 80s and 90s, the research regarding Jewish observance grew. I must say that there's hardly any research written about Jewish observance in the early years of Holocaust historiography, 60s, 70s. And the reason is, there are a few different reasons. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the first way historiography dealt with the Holocaust is to prove the way it existed, the way it was regulated, what happened, focus many times on perpetrator analysis, etc. But over the years, research started to focus on Jewish observance, women, children, other aspects. And in that, they tried to understand what was the role of Jewish observance in ghettos and later camps. And they established a few theories. Now, the slide in front of you shows you the researches written. You could look at the years and where these researches come from that deal with Holocaust, with the historiography of the Holocaust, and focus on Jewish observance. What I want you to notice is what I marked in yellow. The ones I did not mark in yellow focus on written testimonies, not oral ones. The ones in yellow focus on oral testimonies. In other words, one of the things that is lacking in historiography, and again, this will be the focus of this webinar, are the oral testimonies. Are the testimonies that demonstrate it from a more intuitive point of view, less edited, and usually also less formal. However, despite the fact that 99.9 of the religious individuals that survived the Holocaust did not write, but rather spoke, the resources we base our findings on are usually the written ones. And this discrepancy is what I'm trying to demonstrate here. So, if we are informed mainly by resources, A, written by rabbinical figures, formal, B, mostly by men, C, edited, D, after many years, so we could understand that what we are seeing from these testimonies is only a partial view of what happened. And if we integrate into that what we are about to do, oral testimonies, and that is what the USC Shoah Foundation offers, then we could see a broader picture. I want to be very clear on one thing before I dive into these testimonies. I do not exclude the fact that the written testimonies have a certain theorization, which is valid. All I'm trying to do is to have a rather inclusive approach and show other aspects and other patterns. So basically, the continuity paradigm states the following. It asks the question, that is the paradigm that bases how do we understand the role of Jewish religious observance in the camps. That paradigm is based on written testimonies, and I think one of the researchers that articulated it well is Professor Yafa Eliach, which is a Holocaust survivor herself, and she explains the role of Jewish observance as such. Many of the prisoners had lost their last family members and friends. The individual drowned deeper into the abyss, stripped of it all, his family, friends, even his own body fell prey to disease and hunger. All researchers agree to the fact that there is a process of deflation of the self, of the subject lacking agency, lacking a self, struggling to ascertain a sense of self. That they agree on. The starting point is agreed upon. However, what does the religious act mean? Here she goes and explains. In the massive Nazi system of concentration camps, Jews designated and sanctified these few moments, separating them from the twisted reality around them, surrounding them. This act helped them hold on to their life before the war and relate to their future. So notice a few things of this continuity paradigm. A, what does the religious act do? Let's break it down. It creates a separate sphere. Meaning, if the camp is the horrific reality of dehumanization, the religious act is humanization to some degree. It is detached. It creates a separate zone from camp life. This act helped them hold on to their life before the war and relate to their future. It's a continuity. It creates the feeling of self is based on continuity. And this is what the religious act serves. And by the way, this is what I was taught in academia. This is what most students are taught, and which is true, what I will add, to some degree. And I will add another thing, not the singular and only truth. I'll continue. This provided the idea of hope. Hope even that the Jewish modern slaves imprisoned in Nazi camps will hear the arrival of the Messiah. They dreamed of the day that the war will end. So it's positive. It is continuity. It creates a separate sphere. And I'm reading part of how she continues. Prisoners, traditional observance demonstrated the spirit of Judaism that does not submit to the conditions of camp life. Notice what she said, that does not submit. She continues on. They were devoted to their tradition that stood in absolute contrast to Nazi ideology and conduct in the camps. Maintaining the tradition, even for a few moments, created a separate sphere of holiness in the horrific reality of concentration camp life. And she continues the last sentence, she says, that the concentration camp prisoners saw themselves as descendants of the people that overcame Pharaoh, the sons of the Maccabees that triumphed over their oppressors. So we understand this. This makes sense, okay? If we understand this, concentration camp, the reality there is a deflation of self, is a reality where you feel that your existence is jeopardized. Not only your physical, your mental, your spiritual one. And that provides you a feeling of self, which is hopeful, creates continuity, is positive, yet is true as what Yafa Eliach says, this is only relevant for the written testimonies. In the oral testimonies, we will find a different narration. And I broke it down, the argument, which begins with extreme inhuman conditions, continuing on to attempt to establish a self. A religious awareness creates a link to Jewish history, creates this kind of continuity. That's the idea of the continuity paradigm, that the religious act serves as something that provides hope, positive, creates a sense of self, creates a sense of positivity, helps in survival mechanisms. And most of the researchers that you see shown on the screen are researchers that follow this guideline, that see the religious act as a heroic act, but in a specific sense of heroism. A heroic act which is a positive heroism. Heroic act which provides some form of stability in an unstable world. And the thing is that you could see that historiography based itself on resources which are usually, as I've mentioned, rabbinical, written, masculine. The common topics usually deal with legalities or high events, and the theory behind it includes three important words: continuity, a positive approach to religious act, and it is negated to camp conditions. Okay, now I want to challenge that theory. And the following testimonies that I will demonstrate, the first part of them will demonstrate it through practice and show how each one of these elements, positivity, continuity, an idea of a sense of separation, a negation to the camp, are challenged in these oral testimonies. Let's begin with the testimony of Erno Abales. Erno Abales is asked about his religious observance. So he begins about talking about religious observance of others, but then when he goes on to himself, he shows a very uncomfortable truth. A truth, by the way, that when I studied this topic in my bachelor's, I was never confronted with. I was taught in a very specific way. So we will show two testimonies of Erno Abales, and then we will unpack them together.
My brother had a Machzor, Jewish prayer book for the festivals. He paid for it, a whole brand. And we had that film, one set of film we had in the camp, and we put on film every day. whenever, not, I wouldn't, but while we had access to that pair of children, there was queuing up from the early morning till late. And everybody just had to put on the hand film and on the head film and just have to say the first chapter of Shema and the next one. And we're queuing up hundreds of people for that pair of film.
And what else did you do to maintain your Jewish identity?
Well, I don't have to do a lot with the Jewish identity as such, because we were Jews.
Sure.
But I mean, my
Jewish life rather than
Jewish life. I mean, I was eating whatever was provided. And sometimes you know, in the evening with the bread, occasionally you had a bit of piece of salami or something. My brother didn't eat it, but I ate it. I thought I have to. Well, it's most important. I realize that we are now in exceptional times, and the main aim in life now is to survive, and anything else will be subordinate to that. And to be surviving, not only forget about Jewish practice, but also forget about that you are a human being. Anything which matters in life. If you start thinking what you are, what happened, then you will just go and electrocute yourself to the electric wire. But I thought I mustn't think about it. I just has to behave like an animal, just survival to avoid being beaten up, try to get as much food as you can, and just survival. And everything spiritual comes if you manage to survive. And I had some great doubts about it. At the end of the day, I will survive, even after when I survived the selections.
So there is a danger in spirituality. That's what he says. That if you not only are Jewish, if you understand the essence of humanity, and if you're human with all of its glory, that is challenging, because you're in a reality where you're not human. Creating a distance where you're aspiring towards the divine will remind you how far you are from your actual self, and that is a dangerous thing for Erno Abelet. Spirituality, religion, the negating camp life is not serving him as a positive element of survival. He is afraid of that. Listen carefully to his words. I made a conscious decision, right? He says that. He understands what he is doing. He understands that it's not only religion, it's spirituality in general. There is no place for that. You know, it's very interesting how he understands the fact and he strategizes towards it. He understands what he needs to do to survive there, and spirituality is not a positive thing. Prayer is not a positive thing. Actually, at some point it is, but he also sees the danger in it. And he also focuses on survival, but in a way that in order to survive, he has to forget and not remember. He has to stop trying to escape to a reality which is external to his camp life. And he has to sort of swim in it. He continues on, by the way, and he says that if you really think of what is happening, he will go and electrocute himself. In other words, it is a true danger for him to think of spirituality. So the first thing I want you to see in this testimony is that it's not that one shoe fits all. Spirituality, religion, if you take one thing of this webinar, one thing, I would switch a singular paradigm with a diverse one. Humans are different from one another, Jews included, concentration camp prisoners included. Therefore, observant Jews had different patterns and different strategies towards religion, and they did not have the same one. Erno Abeles, that was a rabbi, a devout Jew, he takes pride in the fact that his kids and grandkids are religious. He understands very well that not in all situations it fits. And for him, it served as a negative role. So that's one challenge I want to show you. The second challenging testimony is the testimony of Nili Kochva. And she speaks about the essence, here just so you could see her a bit, and she's a Hungarian Jew, and she speaks about the essence and of an instrumental approach to religion. Let's read a bit about what she says in her testimony. And she talks about why is it that she tried to create a religious act. And the reason was the following. She says, so I read out of the prayer book, out of the Siddur. Of course, this is not the proper way to pray because she got the wrong prayer book. The two stories I have about prayers have to do with the fact they got the wrong prayer book. And then she says, but what difference does it make? You think I know which prayer it was? She read out the wrong prayer for the holiday, but the listeners did not know that. For me, she says, it did not mean anything. So even the prayer means nothing to her. The only thing that means something to her, the main thing was that they, the Jewish prisoners, would believe that it helped. There were people who believed, and there were those who didn't. Belief always helped. Belief is a vitamin. And not only talking about Jewish observance, but also believing in your own strengths. So for her, belief is a positive role. However, she sees belief and practice and religion as an instrumental idea. She sees these elements as something that are used only for survival. They don't carry any spiritual essence. She says for herself, for me, it didn't mean anything. Furthermore, she agrees to the fact that she was luring her listeners, telling them it was the right prayer where it wasn't. But she understands one thing, that in order for people to survive, she takes an opposite approach from Erno Abales. Erno Abales says, in order to survive, you have to not feel. You have to not think. You have to take all of that out. And Nili Kochva, and to be honest, also you see there is a difference in tendencies between men and women. Nili Kochva, she says no, the opposite is true. For us to survive, we need to feel something. We need to be able to cry. We need to be able to connect. It's not about religion. It's not about God. It's not about anything but the connection to the self through an act of opening an emotion, of relating to, and creating a form of hope. So you see such different testimonies and different understandings of that role. Now, if you remember, when I brought you Yafa Eliach's testimony, and here we're going to dive into another aspect, I mentioned a few things. I mentioned A, remember, positivity. 2, negating to camp life. And we mentioned continuity, positivity, and negating camp life. In that, Yafa Eliach compares between the Jews, right? And we had this holiday not long ago of the concentration camps, and the Jews of Egypt, right? That's the comparison Yafa Eliach makes. And the Pharaoh is the Nazi, right? That's a comparison she makes to give sort of a mythical reference. I'm saying that as an introduction because I want to show you how Rina Fradkin revises both of these concepts.
מה שעוד שכחתי לספר זה על פסח, אז סידרנו סדר פסח בלייפציג. ממש איך סידרנו, אז פה עזרו לנו באמת ההונגריות. הם זכרו את הכל לפי הסדר, אני ידעתי עברית טובה. אז אנחנו סידרנו את הסדר לפי לא בדיוק כמו שהיה בהגדה, כי באמת זה היה קשה, אבל אפשר היה להתאים את התקופה שלנו לתקופה של יהודים שהיו במצרים. לפי מכות, כן, הכל היה. היה מכות חושך, לא היה חשמל, מים לא היו, צווארדים, היו לנו קינים, מה שהיה שם, מחלת אור, גרדת, היה רב, היה מכת בכורים, היה, הכל היה. היה לנו אותם המכות, מרור לא היה חסר לנו, לא היו צריכים לשים על השולחן.
Although it's a 30-second testimony, there's something fundamentally interesting about it, and the revision of the myth. They sit down for the Seder. They read out the Haggadah, and they mention the fact that the Jews left Egypt. But if you listen carefully to the comparison, she says, of course it's similar. We suffered everything the Egyptians suffered. She takes the tradition, she turns it around, and she revises it in order so it fits camp life. This is not negating camp life. This is adaptation to the camp. She is adopting the myth or the reality, it does not matter, but she is adapting the religious texts to her reality, and she's saying, we are compared to the Egyptians in this story. We are not the Hebrews. So if I take her adaptation all the way, they will not be redeemed. This is not a story of hope. This is not a story of what is called the opposite bell curve of this is the worst reality, now it gets better. This is not what she says. She says the religiousness, the religious acts serve as an act of expression of their reality. She's expressing the fact that she does not feel like the Hebrews in Egypt. She feels like the Egyptians. She feels like the one that God is against. She feels those are the ones that are the abandoned ones, not the ones that are taken care of. She feels they're the ones that are suffering the plagues, not the ones to be redeemed. And despite that, they make the Seder as similar as possible to the original one. And so we see two things that are, when we look at the oral testimonies, as I said, not always is it positive, and B, it is not negated to camp life. It is part of camp life. They said their prayers in the bathrooms. Their prayers were related directly to what they're going through. And later in this webinar, I'll show you how much that is relevant in the testimony before the last one. And as we continue, you could see that all of these paradigmatic ideas break down when you actually listen to testimonies. If I take a sort of a mental break now, and talk about more an emotional aspect of it, we tend to look at testimonies with a talking energy rather than a listening energy. We want to say what we have to say about them. But when you divert this the other way around, and you start actually listening to what they say about the camps, and not to what you think they say about the camps. Oh, religion was good, religion served this, religion. They say very different things, and each one of them finds a different mechanism how to deal with it. In the testimony I'm showing you about now, Leah Sonnenstein, the rabbi insisted on them making a bracha on the bread and not on the matzah, because he says this reality is different than the reality you know on. And that's the testimony of Leah Sonnenstein. Again, the camp life is not negated to religion. It's an uncontrolled reality where those two things operate together somehow. It's a reality where the theoretical or paradigmatical understandings that we try to impose on it fail to fit. So we struggle with words. Too many researchers about this topic lack the struggle with words and with defining it, because it is really diverse and it is truly pluralistic. What I will show you later are the patterns that I've noticed. Another testimony I want to show you, which is about maybe focuses on the role of why. Why did Bluma Efrati, why did she invest so much on buying the wrong prayer book? Invest meaning the food she had for that day. Because at the end of the testimony, she explains exactly why she gives her portion of food for that siddur, for that prayer book. And I could already give you, I don't spoil it, but I give you what she says at the end. She does not put God as part of that equation. So why does she? This is about 2.5, something like that, minutes of a testimony. She begins with how she found it, and then she will go on to say what did that religious act serve for her. I'm going to go.
אז זה היה נס משמיים, מה אגיד לך? כל יום שעברנו שם היה נס. והיה יחס יפה בינינו לבין האחרות. אם לא רק קרובים וחברים והכל, הייתה שותפות גורל, ככה אכזרית מאוד, אבל שותפות גורל. עכשיו היינו 6 שבועות בבית צוואי לגר, ומשם בראש השנה, ביום הראשון של ראש השנה, מישהו שאל אותי איך אני יודעת מתי היה שבת, מתי היה חג, מתי. אינני יודעת, אבל היו בינינו בנות שהכירו את הלוח העברי. עכשיו היה עוד בבית צבא אל הגר, איזה יומיים שלושה לפני ראש השנה, או יום לפני ראש השנה. שוב העברנו בלוקים לבנים, ובחור יהודי, נער היה, צעיר, אולי היה בן 16, עוצר על ידינו ושואל את אחותי ביידיש, הוא לא היה מהונגריה, אם אנחנו רוצים סידור. בוודאי, כל כך שמחנו, יהיה ראש השנה, נוכל איכשהו להתפלל. טוב, אני אביא לכם מחר, אם באים פה, אז שהוא יביא סידור. אז היה סידור כזה קטן בעצם, כזה סידור קטן, אבל לא היה בו תפילת 3 רגלים לא הייתה בסידור הזה. סידור כזה של כל יום. כן, והוא רוצה בזה מנה של לחם. נתנו את המנה של לחם בכזו שמחה. אז מה באותו יום נאכל חצי מנה? לא נורא. איש לא, הריבונו של עולם לא ביקש את זה ממנו, ולא היה צריך לבקש. הוא בשלו. אבל שמחנו שהיה סידור.
She says two things, Bluma Efrati. She says that she was so happy to get it, the Siddur, the prayer book. She says, at the same time, that she invested it and she gave for her bread for that day. But then she says something interesting, we didn't do it for God. He had no right to ask it for us. We did it for ourselves. She excludes God from the equation of religion. She takes responsibility over the divine. She takes responsibility over herself. She takes responsibility, but she disconnects that, the religious act, from her perception of the originator of it. And she also explains the reason. He was minding his own business. Hu b'shelo in Hebrew. He was doing his thing. And there's a tension in that sentence. There are two tensions. The first tension is if he's doing his own business and he's God and he's benevolent, so why is he not intervening? That tension. The other tension is you can only actually notice it when you listen to the testimony. You could see that when she says the words, he was doing his thing, she's not saying it in disbelief, but rather in disappointment and pain. So you see, for her, the purpose of the religious act was not to create a separate sphere. The purpose of her religious act was survival, and the purpose of her religious act had nothing to do, in her perception, with the divine, but with her and with the community she was part of. And these ideas, these patterns are what you see. The next testimony I will show you, the testimony of Salomon Karlibach, is a testimony where we're going to talk about the profile of the religious act. How did it look like? Okay, people went out and prayed or did something or had a ritual. How did it look like? Did they pray with intention? Did they cry? What did it look like? And interestingly, in this testimony, there's a premise or an assumption of the interviewer that it was graceful or glorified. And Salomon Karlibach actually answers both the text and the subtext of the interviewer when he says, okay, how did it actually look like? You could read the extract on the bottom from his testimony, but I will also let you see it for yourselves and how he describes what is the profile. How does a religious act look like in the camps?
You mentioned that in the Riga ghetto there was some semblance of Jewish life.
Yes.
Did this continue into this workstation that you were at afterward?
Barely. There were just a couple of other from fellows, Orthodox people with me over there, and certainly not enough to organize it. But we did time to time get together and reminded each other that today is this holiday and that, and perhaps a special prayer. I don't think anybody had a prayer book there available, and so it was very, very meager, very little, but it was enough to remind you that you are who's committed to his religion, except like the circumstances were such, like I told you before, that you were just numb, and you lived from day to day, from assignment to assignment, from bowl of food to the next bowl of food, and there were no thoughts of any heroic or dramatic initiatives, like waking up in the middle of the night when nobody was watching and getting together and saying a tearful prayer. None of that took place over there. And it was miraculous enough that this particular station, in purely physical terms, gave me an extra boost of strength that I would be able to last through the second half, of the various camps, which were much more severe, and probably would have killed me simply by fatigue and starvation, if not for this extra reserves that I acquired over there.
He gives an image. He gives the listener a view, creates a world, right? He says, you think of that person waking up in the middle of the night where no one's watching, having a tearful prayer. None of that took place. He says, the subtext, the way I understand it, is if you have an idea as a researcher, as a viewer, as an interviewer, that this is what happened, this is not what happened, the profile of the religious act, he says, was very small, was very meager. The intentions were jeopardized. Because a self, an intentional self, a self that has intentions and wills and ideas, is in a process of deflation, is in a process where he cannot sustain himself. So the prayers look like that and the religious act look like that. If there's no self, how can the religious act be with a self? If the self is a fluctuating self under those conditions, that's how the religious act also looks like. The de-glorified act because there's a de-glorified self. The sense of heroism that we apply on them does not always fit their actual realities. So what I will sort of show you here is if, what I called before the continuity paradigm focuses on a unified idea, on religion as a positivity, and the role of religion is something that serves them as a positive thing of survival, we see that the role here changes from testimony to testimony. The profile of the religious act is very different to each one of these speakers. Each one of them adapts the religious act differently. They have a different perception of God. You could see the sort of a few of the patterns that I've noticed and I've listed on the right side of your screen are very different than the patterns that Yafa Eliach mentions. They do not exclude what she says. What Yafa Eliach says about the continuity paradigm holds true for written texts. However, for oral testimonies, we see diverse meanings, deglorification of the religious acts, breaks in continuity. They use that religious act as a symbol. They explore it. It undergoes subjectivization. There's actually a decline of hope. And yet they are trying to some degree to embed religious act as part of their lives. What I've spoken up until now was a general focus on practice, religious practice. The next two testimonies are going to be a zoom in, one into prayer and the other into belief. Trigger warning. The upcoming testimony, it is not an easy testimony to listen to. When I listened to it, it was very hard for me to listen to it for the first time, and to be fully honest, every time I listen to this testimony, it catches you by surprise. So I'm saying that in advance. It is a 3.5-minute testimony, and what I will ask, we will see it as one unit. It is a testimony of Mania K. We'll talk a bit about her experience maybe later. I want you to notice, what is she praying for? And I want you to ask yourself, to what degree is that similar to prayers you know, and how different that is. After this 3.5-minute testimony, I'll talk for about 2 minutes, and then we'll see one more testimony about belief. Then I'll unpack that for a few minutes, and then we will have some time for questions at the end. So the first testimony is about prayer. The context is in the concentration camp, and she begins with her reality, continues on into what she is praying for. Here we go.
And it happened in the winter time. We were chased out of the block. We had to undress naked. It was snow, ice, cold. There was like I don't know how to describe you, a big round dish, whatever it was huge, like a small pool. We had to dip in that solution to disinfect, to get rid of the ice, of the lice. It was bitter cold. The SS was standing around the women and the men with the dogs. They took pictures and they made fun. I felt so degraded. I felt so humiliated. I was praying that the end of the world should come. I was praying that if there is God, because at that point of my life I had doubts. So I was praying, if there is a God, He should show something, a sign, a miracle. But I wasn't praying to be liberated. I was praying that a hole in the ground should open and everybody should sink in. That was such a degradation. That was such a undescribable humiliation. You stand naked, you cold, you hungry, and they're standing, they're petting their dogs, they're smoking cigarettes, and they're laughing. There isn't any worse thing what can happen to a human being. Absolutely nothing. So that was my prayer. That was my daily prayer, really. I knew that I lost everybody. Nobody is alive. I'm hungry. I knew one thing. I won't survive. I won't get out alive. So what's the use to struggle? I would like to see that something happens to everybody. But nothing like that happened.
She's well aware of what she's doing. She's aware of her prayer. I'm noticing with you, she says this was her constant prayer. She prayed daily for the end of the world to come. Her prayer is beyond the point of redemption. She is not praying for redemption. She does not share the hope Yafa Eliach says of a future where things will get That's not what she prays for. She's very explicit about what she does, and she's very aware about the prayer she chooses, because she begins and she says, no, I did not pray for that. I prayed for the end of the world to come. And when you look at content of prayers, they're also different. As you see here, the content of the prayer is different. You see people praying for them to die, for themselves. You see them revising their prayers, revising their religious identity to the degree where it fits camp conditions. And prayer beyond the point of redemption is the prayer that fits camp conditions. And you see that, by the way, the agency of prayer, the people that pray, they pray even in cases where they do not believe. Prayer was an expression, an opportunity to do two things at the same time: to approach God and to fully relate to the reality they were in, which was her will for the end of the world to come. And how different this is than how Holocaust and Jewish observance is taught, with this, what I call a messaging element. Have a good message, be hopeful. And I think this testimony teaches us another thing we have to apply when we look at Holocaust testimony. How do we listen? How quickly do we expect to get a message from it? Or rather, is the message embedded in expanding our listening, for example, to a testimony like that, where she's explicit about her will? The next testimony I want to apply also that listening approach. It's a 2-minute testimony by Helen Handler. And in this testimony, she talks about her belief system. And that belief system is a system that undergoes 4 changes in 2 minutes. And that's a testimony we will end with. What I want you to notice is the same way that prayer changes, belief changes for the same person over a course of time. I want you to notice 2 things. What is her belief in every stage, before, during, after, and after the Holocaust? How she changes, how she explains that change. Without further ado, the testimony of Helen Handler.
And today, after the war, I really believed in God in war. That's a question I always get. Of course I believed. What else was I going to believe? I certainly couldn't believe in human compassion or justice or law. I couldn't even believe in a just God. I didn't know what I was doing there.
Number 1, she believes in the Holocaust. During the Holocaust, she believes in a God, but not in a just God. She, in monotheistic religions, there are 3 elements of God: good, all-knowing, right, benevolent, all-knowing, and almighty. She says, okay, she takes away the good. She takes away the benevolence. So she believes in a God that has 2 out of 3 legs. However, she continues on and talks about her belief after, which changes.
I had to believe in a God of miracles. And yes, I believed in God. Only the people who believed in God survived. And you couldn't let go for a second, because if you let go, you couldn't work your way up. So yes, I believed. But once I was saved, I couldn't believe. When Yom Kippur,
before she speaks about Yom Kippur, you could see after the war she couldn't believe. Why couldn't she believe? Because it no longer served her. She says that. It served her because she had to work her way up as a survival element. She already survived, so why believe after? So she explains why she believes after, or what form of belief she has.
Came along, I said, how can I ask God forgive me? I didn't forgive him yet. And then I had a child.
During the war, she believes in a 2 out of 3 God, excluding benevolence. After the war, she believes in God of miracles. After the war, she believes in a God that she can express her anger towards. She doesn't believe, but then she says, I'm still angry. I can't go to Yom Kippur because he didn't apologize to me. Stage number 3 is when she's a bit older and she has a family.
I knew that I owe another Jew to the Jewish people. But how am I going to do it? Not through me. So I put him in a day school. and I expected them to raise a Jew. But it's of course a mistake. So today, Mom, you were so many...
Before this, so stage number 3, outsourcing. She feels she's not good enough to teach religion. She wants it in her life, but not directly. So, stage number 3 in belief is proxy belief. Stage number 4 is what she says is the following.
Dimensional, he says, and now you are just one-dimensional. Well, it took me many years, but I came to a full circle. I still work at it very hard. But when people ask me, do you believe in God? Well, we are talking. I say.
That's the favorite sentence of mine of this whole lecture. They ask her, does she believe in God? And she says, well, we are talking, I say. And I think she also offers a new perception on belief. Her belief undergoes so many changes due to the Holocaust, adaptations. And she stands behind it. She says, yes, I believe, but not in the structured, formal. I believe in a way that, yes, we are talking. It's a dialogue. It's an ongoing dialogue that she has, where the dynamics of it are just as strong and potent as the content of it. And what I tried showing you today, and this I'll end with, is how oral testimonies of the Holocaust can inform an expansion of what religious observance means in practice, prayer, and belief, and how much these individuals operated not only as recipients of Jewish religion, but as inventors of adaptations, of symbolism that their reality forced them to create. And I wanted to show you these individuals not only as survivors, but I will say as theologians, people that create new understandings of what religion actually means. And now if there are any questions, this is the time.
Themes you showed about belief and spirituality, could this be seen also in survivors of other genocides besides the Jewish people?
Okay, that's a very good question. I will first quote Rashi, "Lamed leshoncha lomar ani yodea," meaning teach your tongue to say I don't know. Meaning I researched mainly Holocaust survivors, a few from the Roma, a few from Rwanda. I did do a bit of research regarding that. What I have noticed is very similar patterns, actually. I've noticed adaptation, symbolization, and deglorification. Those 3 elements can be seen in other genocides. I must limit my findings only to monotheistic religions. It works differently when we look at mass violence in non-monotheistic religions, because their relationship with the divine is, or with what they perceive as God or gods, is different.
All right. How willing were most of the survivors to be interviewed about questions regarding their religion and spirituality?
There's no difference between that and other topics. I do find something interesting in these interviews, that the flippability of it. Don't know if there's a word like that. How they go both ways. They say, we absolutely believe, no matter what, we believe in Hashem, we believe in God, we have no questions. And at the same time, they could say everything you've seen here. What I've noticed is actually they're very comfortable saying or talking about it. And when they talk about it, they demonstrate the paradoxes in their belief system and the tensions or the complexities of it.
Now, I know you weren't the one during the interviews yourself, but people have asked, do you know how long after the Holocaust these interviews took place and who were the interviewers?
So I'll say a few things. First of all, many of them took place in the 80s and 90s. There are a few earlier testimonies also taking place. However, for me, it was important that this is the first time they talk about it. Meaning the oral testimony is where all of their histories is concentrated into a 3-hour talk. So there's a immediacy to it, and that's why I chose it. Some are earlier, some are later. I did not notice a difference in patterns between earlier and later testimonies. Actually, sometimes even the later testimonies are more elaborate, or more, I would say, vulnerable. They open more, actually. Not late, not in late 90s, but 80s, and those times are really I find the most interesting years.
All right. The people we saw interviewed were mostly, or maybe all of them, survivors of concentration camps. Do we see a difference between survivors of the Holocaust who were not in concentration camps?
Absolutely yes. 100% yes. In other words, this research, my findings, what I've talked about today, have to do with concentration camps, not ghettos. I called it deconstruction processes because of the basic difference is that in the ghetto, usually there was a religious system at play, a formal one. There was a rabbi to some degree. There was a discussion about kosher or not kosher food. There was a community. All of that does not exist in a concentration camp. So that's why the research was focused on concentration camps. This is not a strict, categorical differentiation. However, generally speaking, concentration camps created a reality where the sense of self was jeopardized, and that was manifested into how they dealt with it very differently than in the ghettos. That's a generalization I would be careful with, but that being said, you see in most testimonies that there are differences between ghettos and camps.
Okay. I'd like to end also by saying thank you very much to USC for letting us use their testimonies in their lecture. They've been very helpful. And I think we've all learned a lot, David, from your lecture. And we'll be entering Holocaust Memorial Day with new thoughts in our heads. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.